Hey everybody, it's Sean. In this video, we're going to be walking through placing some more objects on the perspective grid and getting a little bit more used to how the controls work. If you're still set up in the previous video where you might have fooled around with a perspective grid a lot and you're not really sure how to get it back to normal, we can just go up to View, Perspective Grid, and then click on 2-point perspective, and it'll just snap it back to its default settings. Cool. So let's sort of just get on into it. I'm just going to increase mine. I like it to be a little bit taller, a little bit wider on both sides. There we go. And all right, sounds good. I'm going to hit 4 on my keyboard just so I'm not actually drawing anything on a perspective. And I'm just going to draw out a few shapes with a few different colors. That way we can differentiate things from each other. So I have one rectangle. Whoops. I have a rectangle. I'm going to use an ellipse tool like so. I'm going to make this like an orangish color. Sounds good. Cool. And then let's just for fun maybe draw out a triangle. And let's make this maybe bright pink or something. Or magenta, you know, whatever works. There we go. Cool. So with our rectangle selected, we can hit 1 on the keyboard. Actually, I lied. We need to have our perspective grid tool selected for the keyboard shortcut number commands to work. So perspective grid tool selected, 1 on the keyboard. We can hit Shift V to switch over to our perspective selection tool. And we can place this guy on the perspective grid. And I'm just going to click the edge of the corner holding Alt Shift, and I'm going to scale it on up so that we have a nice big fat rectangle on one side. And the really cool thing here is if we sort of click and drag it down, you can see how it's just getting larger and smaller. And that's fine, but what happens if you want things to actually pop off the perspective grid? That's a whole other sort of challenge. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that right now. So I'm going to leave the rectangle tool right here. I'm going to grab the triangle very carefully. Don't just click on it because it'll just snap it somewhere on the grid. But I'm going to click and drag it onto my perspective grid. And you can see, yeah, sure, it's layered on top of the rectangle. I'm just going to expand it a little bit more so that people can actually see what's going on. And I want it to actually stick out away from the rectangular object. And to do that, what we can do is we can hold Command and we can click and drag it forward. And what this is doing is it's actually using Z space to drag the object in front of the rectangle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift Command I to make the perspective grid disappear for a second. And I'm going to just apply a drop shadow to this so that we can better illustrate what's happening. And yes, I know it's the world's ugliest drop shadow. Bear with me here for a second. Just going to make it a little less ugly. I know that sounds so weird. But here, so we have our drop shadow. I'm holding Command, and you can actually, I'm holding Command, and you can see that I am dragging this out from our perspective, and subsequently we can also put it we can use Command and drag it further into the perspective, right? If we wanted to, we could also control the layer stack. Sorry, I'm having a hard time speaking today. So if you see my ellipse, it's on top of the rectangle, or sorry, my polygon is on top of the rectangle. I can send it behind the rectangle, and I can still control how far behind the rectangle it's actually sitting in Z space. Next, I'm going to turn on my perspective grid again by hitting Shift Command I. And with my perspective grid selection tool, I'm going to bring this circle on board. There we go. And I want to apply another drop shadow to the circle just again so we can see the difference between what's happening. I'm going to hit OK. And we can press and hold Command to bring it forward in space, which it doesn't seem to want to come forward with us right now. I don't know why. Oh, come on. Don't you just love it when things don't work out the way you need it to? But that is one way to sort of control perspective on top of things, is to meticulously layer your objects and sort of fake by scale how you want things to sort of be controlled within this environment. There we go. Now you can see it's sort of getting a little bit further out from our rectangle. It's all just a matter of scale and sort of placement and spacing. But perspective grids can be one of those things that really takes a lot to wrap your mind around. So if you're having some problems at the beginning, don't worry. It sort of happens to everybody, especially when we're learning something this complicated. The best way, though, that I found to deal with the perspective tool is to kind of break down your drawing into smaller shapes and think about if these shapes had to interact with one another, what would they look like, right? So I'm just going to quickly delete our blue rectangle. I'm going to turn off my perspective grid for a second, and let's just build a couple of walls. So I'm going to build a blue wall here, and I'm going to duplicate it. And now what I want to do is I want to take my rectangle tool and I want to build some white squares. Let's do this. Whoops. Just make sure you don't have that other wall selected. Nice white square. Oh, come on. Nothing wants to work for me this morning. There we go. And let's just build out, you know, we're basically building a building wall really quickly. I know it's super basic, but it always works. It always gets the trick done here. So I'm just going to duplicate these a couple of times. Kind of looks like a domino, actually. Kind of fun. There we go. And I'm going to turn this guy red. There we go. And actually, because the side of the perspective grid is blue, I don't want this to be blue. Let's make this like maybe a seafoamy teal color. That's really hard to look at, but actually that's very hard to look at. We're gonna make this one orange, and we're gonna make this one maybe green. There we go. That's a little bit better. And I'm just gonna select all of my windows when it cooperates with me. There we go. And what I want to do is I actually want to group these. So select everything, hit group, and let's just move them off to the side for a minute. There we go. And let's go turn our perspective grid back on. It might be hiding under the perspective grid selection tool, so perspective grid. Cool. Let's use the perspective grid selection. We're going to be dealing with the left grid. We can use number 1 on our keyboard to get there. And I want to grab my entire group and I want to position it so that it's right at the edge of our perspective grid. And then I'm going to grab the top left corner. I'm going to hold shift and I'm going to scale it up. And now I want to put this green wall on the other side, on the right hand side. So I'm going to use 3 on my keyboard to switch over to the right hand wall. And I'm going to click and drag this onto that section. I want to snap it to the top left corner, and I'm going to click and drag this down so that it reaches the floor. And I can turn my perspective grid off by hitting Shift Command I. And there we can see we have a building that's built on a perfect perspective, and it used grouped elements, grouped shapes to sort of make this happen. And now the next thing that I want to see, I'm very curious about, is if, whoops, sorry guys, I accidentally pasted something there from a different video. So I'm going to use my perspective grid selection tool, and I want to ungroup everything from this window, or from this wall rather, and I want to just grab a window and I want to pop this off of our perspective grid. And yeah, you can see that we can ungroup things and we can actually control things in a sort of individual manner. So that's why personally for me, if I pre-build a lot of elements and I sort of systematically group them together and then paste them all onto the perspective grid at once, it sort of makes it a lot more manageable in terms of how to set up super complicated perspectives like the example that I showed you before. So in this example, I know for if we just look at our layers panel and I just sort of go and collapse certain things, you can see that I have several attempts, but my male piece is all one piece. My shadow is another layer. The actual sort of male client is another section. The shadow is another layer. And then finally, the phone is actually another layer as well, and it's separated from the background. All of these things I sort of had pre-built and just slapped onto the perspective grid and then started to fine-tune certain things. So I hope that sort of helps to clarify how to bring things onto the perspective grid. By all means, feel free, play around with 1, 2, and 3-point perspective and get a little bit more familiar with how each one works. I'll catch you guys in the next video. See you later.